The 1980s were an era of wild invention, when horror walked a strange line between laughter and lunacy, between grindhouse sleaze and surreal art. It was the decade of VHS shelves, neon nightmares, and low-budget brilliance that felt handmade, imperfect but unforgettable. These weren't blockbusters. They were the films that lived on after midnight, flickering through cathode ray light, whispering through static, and staining memory like blood on old tape. Tonight, we're rewinding the tape and revisiting 8 forgotten nightmares from the 1980s. Films too eerie to fade, too haunting to forget. In Motel Hell, made in 1980, the roadside motel becomes a slaughterhouse wrapped in neon hospitality. Rory Calhoun plays Farmer Vincent, a grinning patriarch famous for his smoked meats and country charm. His sister Ida helps run the business, cheerful, peculiar, and always busy in the garden. But what grows beneath their soil is not vegetables, it's people. Blending rural horror with twisted humor, Motel Hell feels like a fever dream, born from the fumes of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and the irony of Psycho. The film's tagline, "It takes all kinds of critters to make Farmer Vincent's fritters," says everything. Beneath its cornpone grin lies satire, absurdity, and a kind of evil that laughs as it kills. Director Kevin Connor keeps the tone deliriously unstable. Equal parts black comedy, cannibal nightmare, and social parody. Motel Hell mocks the commercialization of death, the packaging of horror into something palatable, and that's what makes it so enduring. When the smoke clears from Farmer Vincent's pit, you realize that the joke is on us. Because in Motel Hell, humanity's appetite is the real monster. In After Midnight, 1989, fear becomes academic. On the first day of class, a psychology professor terrifies his students with a chilling lesson. Fear is the strongest human emotion. When they protest, he smiles and invites them to a late-night experiment. What follows is an anthology of terror, 3 stories that bleed together until the line between lecture and nightmare disappears. Directed by Ken and Jim Wheat, After Midnight feels like a forgotten campfire told through fluorescent light. Each story explores a different kind of dread: the vulnerability of a home invasion, the loneliness of a ghostly phone call, the surreal panic of being stranded in the dark. Pulling them all together is a classroom that slowly devolves into chaos, binding the tales with eerie precision. It's a quieter, more cerebral kind of anthology horror, closer to Tales from the Crypt than Creepshow. What it lacks in budget, it makes up for in atmosphere. Long shadows, practical effects, and the haunting suggestion that fear itself might be contagious. By the end, you're not sure if you've watched a film or participated in an experiment. Either way, After Midnight proves that horror doesn't need monsters when the lesson plan is terror itself. In The Entity, made in 1982, terror doesn't wear a mask or speak a name. It's invisible, relentless, and profoundly personal. Barbara Hershey stars as Carla Moran, a single mother assaulted by an unseen force inside her Los Angeles home. The attacks are brutal, inexplicable, and deeply psychological. When she turns to doctors for help, her trauma is dismissed as hysteria, making her isolation almost as terrifying as the haunting itself. Directed by Sidney J. Furie and loosely inspired by a real case, the film plays like an autopsy of disbelief. The camera floats and drifts unnaturally, mimicking the entity's omnipresence. A voyeur that can't be stopped. The soundtrack pulses with synthetic dread, as if the haunting itself has found a rhythm. What sets the entity apart from its peers is its refusal to explain. There's no exorcism, no closure, no convenient mythology. The horror is raw and unresolved, a nightmare that doesn't obey cinematic rules. Hershey's performance anchors the chaos with humanity. She is terrified, humiliated, and ultimately defiant. The entity lingers because it makes the intangible terrifying. You can't see it, reason with it, or understand it. You can only feel its breath at your back, steady, unseen, and waiting. In the Funhouse, 1981, the carnival arrives at night. All colored bulbs, mechanical laughter, and the faint smell of fried sugar and rust. Beneath the music and mirrors lies something older, something hungry. 4 teenagers chasing cheap thrills decide to hide inside the fairground's haunted ride after hours. But once the lights go out, the Funhouse isn't an attraction anymore. It's a cage. Directed by Tobe Hooper, the visionary behind the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, this film trades the open horror of the rural wasteland for the claustrophobia of artifice. Every corridor glows with false color. Every animatronic face feels just a little too alive. What begins as teenage mischief spirals into a grim fairy tale of cruelty and confinement. Hooper crafts the setting as a living organism, metallic and decaying, echoing with mechanical screams. The monster at its heart, disfigured and tragic, feels less like a villain and more like a secret the carnival keeps chained up. The Funhouse is grotesque and hypnotic, turning spectacle itself into the source of dread. When the ride ends and the gears fall silent, you're left staring at the masks, the blinking lights, and the truth Hooper always knew. The carnival was never meant to entertain you. It was built to feed. In Sleepaway Camp, 1983, summer looks harmless. Sunlit docks, bug spray, and cafeteria laughter that echoes across a quiet lake. But from the opening tragedy, a freak boating accident that leaves young Angela the lone survivor, something feels crooked, like a picture frame that never hangs straight. Years later, Angela arrives at Camp Arawak with her cousin Ricky, sent off by their bizarrely theatrical Aunt Martha, whose sing-song cheer hides a private madness. What follows wears the mask of a standard teen slasher, but the mood is off in unsettling ways. Performances teeter between shrill and sincere. The camera lingers a little too long on ordinary moments until they curdle. Kills arrive with grim imagination, less about splatter than the sense that this camp's world itself is predatory. Written and directed by Robert Hiltzik, Sleepaway Camp feels both trashy and transgressive. Beneath the pranks and bunkhouse gossip runs a deeper unease about identity, repression, and cruelty. And then there's the ending. Wordless, feral, unforgettable. An image that escaped the movie and took up residence in horror history. In Opera, 1987, the stage becomes a slaughterhouse. Under the gleam of chandeliers and the whisper of velvet curtains, an unseen killer watches a young soprano from the shadows. Christina Marciak plays Betty, a rising opera star whose dreams are poisoned by obsession. When her mentor is struck down, she's thrust into the lead role, and into the sights of a murderer who forces her to witness every brutal act he commits. Directed by Dario Argento, Opera is a fever dream of blood and beauty. The director's last great masterwork, and perhaps his most technically audacious. The film brims with visual invention. Ravens soaring through theater rafters, needles taped beneath eyelids, the killer's point of view gliding like a phantom through the corridors of art and madness. Each frame feels like a painting cracking under pressure. Argento fuses violence with elegance, crafting a giallo that's both self-reflective and savage, a meditation on control, voyeurism, and creation itself. The camera doesn't just observe the horror, it participates in it. What lingers isn't the gore but the paradox, that something so horrifying could be so exquisitely composed. In Opera, every scream becomes part of the score, every drop of blood another note in Argento's last aria. In The Kindred, 1987, horror isn't born from the grave, it's grown in a lab. The story begins with a dying scientist and a final, terrible secret. On her deathbed, she begs her son to destroy her research and to find his brother. But her son doesn't have a brother, at least not one that should exist. Directed by Stephen Carpenter and Jeffrey Obrow, The Kindred feels like a mutation of Frankenstein and The Fly, soaked in late 80s atmosphere. Hidden beneath the family home is a lab filled with failed experiments. Jars that breathe, flesh that moves, and something in the shadows that shouldn't be alive. The creature effects created by Matthew Mungle are extraordinary, practical, grotesque, and strangely tragic. What gives The Kindred its power isn't just the slime and sinew, but its melancholy. It's a story about legacy, about how the monsters we inherit are often the ones our parents tried to perfect. It's eerie, intelligent, and quietly heartbreaking. A reminder that in the 1980s, horror still had the courage to mix terror with tenderness. And somewhere, behind a locked door, Anthony is still waiting to meet his brother. In Nightwish, 1989, reality dissolves like smoke. A group of graduate students and their unhinged professor travel to a desolate mansion to test theories of dream manipulation and psychic projection. Their goal, to prove that fear itself can summon entities from another plane. What they awaken, however, doesn't just cross dimensions, it rearranges them. Directed by Bruce R. Cook, Nightwish feels like a hallucinatory cousin to From Beyond and A Nightmare on Elm Street, yet stranger still. The film slips between dreams and waking life until neither can be trusted. Lab experiments morph into seances, time loops fracture, and grotesque creatures crawl from green mist like half-formed thoughts. Its practical effects, slime-slicked, pulsating, impossibly vivid, evoke that late 80s period when horror still looked tactile, not digital. Beneath the madness lies a philosophical question. If terror can shape reality, then who controls the dream? Nightwish suggests that science, faith, and insanity might all be the same door, just opened from different sides. The result is a cinematic nightmare, both cerebral and physical, a hypnotic descent into madness where the only certainty is that you're still asleep, and when you finally wake, you'll wonder whether the dream ever ended. They just don't make them like this anymore. The horror of the 1980s was handmade, imperfect, ambitious, and sincere. These films weren't built to sell toys or open franchises. They were experiments in fear, stitched together with imagination, madness, and the smell of celluloid decay. Each one came from a time when horror still believed in mystery. They frightened us because they reminded us how fragile we are when the lights go out. If you enjoyed this descent into forgotten fear, like the video, subscribe, and tell us which of these haunted relics still lingers in your mind. You've been watching Silver Shivers, where horror never dies, it just gets remastered.